Hey everyone, I am so excited for this panel. We're talking about biracial main characters in fantasy as our title for the panel. And this is just I'm so excited for this panel because I feel like I had this idea a while ago and I wasn't sure if I would be able to like get it together, as a lot of, brainchilds don't necessarily leave the nest. But I'm really excited that this one did. And so I'm just going to say a little bit about myself, and then our authors will tell us about themselves and their books, and then we'll go into the questions. If you have any questions as well, drop them in the chat and I will go back to them during the question time. So if you don't know who I am, my name's Lily, and I am the book person behind Utopia State of Mind. So we'll start with the author bios. Rebecca, do you want to start?
Oh, yes. Okay. Hi, I'm Rebecca Kim Wells. I'm the author of three young adult fantasy books, the first two being Shatter the Sky and Storm the Earth, which is the duology I'm going to be talking about today mostly. And then Briar Girls, which is a queer fairy tale mashup, sort of a standalone fantasy. And I'm excited to be here. Yay.
Wait, was I muted that whole time?
No, you were talking.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm Vanessa. I'm the author of Only a Monster and the forthcoming sequel, Never a Hero, which is about a monster girl whose summer is ruined when the cute guy at work turns out to be a monster slayer.
Hate it when that happens. Hi, I'm Tara Sim. I am the author of the Timekeeper trilogy, which is a historical fantasy / steampunk queer romance sort of action adventure books, and the Scavenge the Stars duology, which is also very much action adventure fantasy. Most recently, my adult epic fantasy debut is The City of Dusk, the sequel of which comes out this August.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. Hi, I'm Kylie Lee Baker. I'm the author of The Keeper of Night duology, which is a historical fantasy about a half British Grim Reaper, half Japanese Grim Reaper girl who makes a questionable deal with Japan's goddess of death, and also the forthcoming The Scarlet Alchemist duology, which is about necromancy in ancient China. So excited to be here and talk to you guys.
So my first question is for people who haven't read all of the books on this panel. And so it's just basically if you could just give us some background into specifically your main characters and your inspiration to write your main characters. And you can obviously talk about, their identity as well if you'd like to. So Rebecca, do you want to start this one too?
Sure. I was thinking like Shatter the Sky was my debut novel. It came out in 2019, and I have not thought about it since I finished writing it, really. So I was like, what is this book about, actually? It is the angry bisexual dragon novel, as it's been called on the internet, and the main character is Marin, who lonely mountain town that's kind of run down, and they used to have dragons, and their dragons were stolen from them by this evil emperor. And it's about what happens when her girlfriend is also stolen, and she decides that she's not going to take this anymore. She's going to go steal a dragon back and get her girlfriend. And I was drawn to writing Marin because I was sick of, at the time, the whole chosen one trope. So I was like, I'm sick of everybody being like the secret prince, the secret whatever, the one destined to do anything. So I'm going to write this main character who is kind of a homebody, who's very happy in her little life, who's kind of scared of taking big steps, but then is forced to when circumstances change outside her control.
So Only a Monster, it follows a half monster girl named Joan, who I've already spoiled it, but she at the beginning of the book is about to go on a date, and that's really the last calm moment in the book because she learns that this guy that she's had a crush on all summer is a monster slayer, and it's from her point of view. And I was really my original inspiration was really that experience you sometimes get when the hero of a story isn't necessarily the hero of your story. So in this book, she's fighting, this monster slayer. And I was really inspired by those kind of big blockbuster movies that I grew up on, where you would just never see, I would never see anybody who was heroic on screen who was of the Asian diaspora, someone like me. But instead, I would often see, for some reason, that the bad guys, the kind of these characters who wouldn't speak, who didn't have a name, would show up in a group and fight the hero, and then they would often get beaten up and sometimes killed and then left there. And that would be the only time I would see it myself on screen in some of those movies. So it really inspired me to want to write a book about what does it feel like when a hero, and maybe even a really good hero, someone who's very decent and upright, as presented by the narrative, is fighting against you rather than for you. And then I really wanted to include some explicit representation as well. I wanted my character to have kind of a similar background to mine. So her dad and my dad are both Chinese Malaysian.
I guess I'll mostly talk about Scavenge the Stars today. That is basically a young adult retelling of the Count of Monte Cristo, where instead of just like a dude breaking out of prison getting revenge, it's a teenage girl. So she's wreaking havoc with her knives and everything. It's great. So a little bit of like Pirates of the Caribbean-ish vibes in there. But Amaya's whole deal is basically her identity, not even like so much in like a race sense, but because she is pretending to be a countess and she grew up destitute. So she had to have training to be able to do this. And she had to have training to learn how to fight and how to get revenge and like how to play somebody, how to con somebody. And when she starts out, she's actually known by a completely different name as well on this ship that she's been indentured on since she was a kid. So she has Silverfish, which is her like indentured name, her actual name Amaya, and then she has Countess Yama. And so she has these three things that she kind of has to cycle through. And because she is from a colonized state and her father is from a completely different country, she has all of these different levels of like, who gets my loyalty and like who am I really, what do I think about my own culture or like cultures outside of mine. So it's all kind of like a big like Shrek, like Onion.
I haven't read your books yet, but now I need to. I'm sold just with that description. So the main character, Ren, in The Keeper of Night, as I said, is a half British Grim Reaper and half Japanese Shinigami, which is like a Japanese Grim Reaper. And so I wanted to write her because I wanted to speak very, very explicitly towards the experience of being biracial, but sort of wrapped up in this fantasy Christmas decorations. And I really wanted to address the trope that I'd seen a lot in fantasy of this main character who is two different magical species, or like half one magical species and half human. And it's this fantasy trope of being torn between two different worlds. But for a lot of people like us, I might say, that's not always a fantasy trope. It's a reality. And so I wanted to address that with a character who is two different species, but also two different races, to really engage with what it really means to belong or not belong to two different worlds at once.
Yeah, and that is a perfect segue to the next question. So thank you. I'm chatting, or I want to talk a little bit about the world building specifically and approaching different identities in your world. And so for Vanessa and Kylie, obviously yours have more contemporary than other books in this panel. So for you to maybe, talking about how you use fantasy elements to comment or impact your main characters. But yeah, I wanted to know how you all approach identities in relation to world building. So Vanessa, do you want to start?
Yes. Excuse me. One thing I will say, I really loved how Kylie and I were kind of coming from really similar places when we were writing. When I was reading her book, I was like, wow, I was really identify with what's going on here. So I think I created a world like Kylie, where there's kind of explicit representation, and then sort of not really a metaphor that goes very far for me, which is that there are monsters and humans as well. And my main character is half monster, half human. And I didn't so much want to comment on that as like the main, like it's not really a metaphor that goes far, obviously. But what I wanted to write about was a character who, like me, can really move between worlds, sometimes belonging, sometimes not belonging. And especially, I wanted to write a character who doesn't get to have a very simple perspective on the world. I mean, my background is my dad is Chinese Malaysian, my mother was Maltese. I grew up in Australia, and so there was such a mix of cultures happening in my life, where I necessarily held multiple perspectives, multiple cultural perspectives on the world, multiple perspectives on the world at all times. And I really wanted to give the reader that kind of same experience by having the point of view of a monster. So, these people are doing bad things. You do understand the human side, but at the same time, I hope that you don't want the monsters to die. You don't want them to be killed by the hero. So I wanted a character that could hold both of those perspectives at the same time. And I wanted the reader to have that experience too, where they're also holding the perspective at the same time. They understand kind of both sides of the story. And they don't want anyone to die, maybe, hopefully. And yeah, because the main character really loves people on both sides. So I think, for me, that was really coming from my own kind of biracial experience. You can't really easily choose a side.
I think with both Scavenge the Stars and the Timekeeper trilogy, it really, in terms of how the world building kind of affects identity and vice versa, it really comes down to colonization. Because, being half Indian, that's like the big story of India, right? We were colonized for an extremely long time. And so in the case with Daphne and the Timekeeper trilogy, I gave her something very similar to me where she is white passing. So nobody actually knows that she is like infiltrating these spaces as somebody who is actually Indian. They're just like, oh, yes, another white person. And she's like, no. And so I get to kind of, with the Timekeeper trilogy with via Daphne, I kind of like put a lot of my own perspective of identity into her in navigating these two different worlds where you're trying to be in this one world that that you belong in, but nobody thinks you belong in it because you don't look like you belong in it. And then in Scavenge with Amaya, it's much less about that and more about her like trying to find where exactly she belongs in this world, not based on what other people think, but based on how she thinks. And she doesn't know because she had this attachment with her father who she thinks passed away when she was very young, and he's from this other country that she's never even been to. And so a lot of her realization about who she is coming from these different like identities that she has to switch between, and finally like traveling beyond her home country and like seeing how other people live. And she's like, okay, I think like it doesn't really matter where I belong. Like no matter where I go, I need to feel at home, like in my skin. So it's more about her trying to realize like I don't belong to like a single place. Like it's more about how I feel on a daily basis, if that makes sense at all.
So I didn't want to cut in line, but I wanted to talk about what Vanessa was saying, because she and I actually did an Instagram live where we talked about how we'd accidentally written the same book in a lot of ways. And one thing we talked about there, one fantasy element was this idea of monsters and monstrosity, who's considered a monster. So in our books, we have characters who are quite literally monsters in some ways, but are also just treated socially as social pariahs, and how that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy when you ostracize certain people and decide that they are monsters, that can end up being what they become. So that's just a little side note that I thought was interesting. I sort of already touched on this question before I jumped the gun with the first question, though I'll also say that in terms of fantasy elements in The Keeper of Night, One thing I did was design the different magic systems for the two different groups, the Reapers and Shinigamis, based on different cultural elements. So Anko is the main character, or the leader of the Reapers, we can say, who's based on this Celtic figure. Well, he is a Celtic figure, but the fictional version in the book is based on him, which evokes that very traditional, well, now commercialized Grim Reaper. So that's sort of hourglass imagery, and that's why the Reapers control time. And then the Shinigami, their powers are derived from this Shinto legend. They control light because they live in this pitch black underworld. So I tried to create two very different worlds that are both culturally very rich, but also equally flawed, because both end up being these oppressive hierarchical systems. And so my point was to show that they're very different, but also very similar in terms of how they treat minorities. And so that realization that one of them is not going to be the main character's oasis of happiness and eternal joy is a big part of her journey.
My world in Shatter the Sky is really, as Tara was saying, like all about colonization, which is to say the main character Marin is her mother, and where she is from this group nation called Elvera, and she grew up very isolated in that nation, this mountain town of people. But her father is Zafedi. He's from the Empire of Zafed, which people came in, this whole world and sort of imposed their culture and political structure on top of like the pre-existing people. So by the time that was a couple hundred years before the events of the book. So by the time we see this place, it's very intertwined in a way that can't easily be separated. And Marin herself, she has a lot of like mixed feelings about it, because even though she's raised in Elvera and considers herself Farron, she looks a lot more like her dad than her mom. So even though that's where she feels at home, there's still a part of her that always feels a little out of place. And that helps her when she has to go pretend to be like full Zafedi to infiltrate like this fortress and steal a dragon. But she also still feels very conflicted about, like, this is a culture that I don't really know all that well. I haven't spent a lot of time here, but I look like them. What does that mean? And by setting foot in like the greater empire, she also has to confront for the first time, like the real effects that the empire has had on her home in a way that she didn't as long as she stayed like in her safe little town. So the first book really involves like her facing the effects of colonization in a way that she didn't have to before. And then the second book involves being very angry about that and deciding to do things about it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I wanted to also, that's a great point, because I wanted to talk a little bit about character arcs throughout sequels and character arcs over an entire series, because one of the things that I've loved about everyone's sequel that I've read so far is that there's such a sequel has this possibility and opportunity to open up a character's journey and the character's world, to figure out what their changing and evolving relationship with their identity and the people around them presents itself. So do you all feel that having a sequel of some sort allows you more space to delve into their identity and how they relate to the world? And if so, in what way? Tara, do you want to start?
Yeah, I have many sequels. To go back to Timekeeper again, because I also have biracial character in that, so I feel like I need to talk about it as well. Definitely the sequels opened up a lot. When I first wrote Timekeeper way back in the day, I thought it was going to be a standalone, and I was like, no, their story is not done. And then in writing book 2, I was like, I'm going to have a Daphne POV because she intrigues me a lot. And what if they go to India during the British Raj? How would she deal with that? How would all of them deal with that being from England? And it was really interesting. Like, I did so much research on it, more research than I've ever done for a single book. But it really, I think, evolved not just Daphne's character, but like everybody, like by putting them in these different like situations. And even like book 3 for sure. And with Scavenge the Stars, I kind of already mentioned it a bit, how Amaya, her whole journey is just being comfortable within her own skin and what identity she wants to fall on. So she's like, am I this? Am I that? Am I this person? Or do I want to portray myself as, you know, cold and aloof? Do I want to try to be more friendly to people, more trusting? So with the sequel, Ravage, it's really more about her trying to figure out who exactly Amaya is in the world and opening herself up more to people who she wouldn't originally have opened herself up to.
Okay, I'll talk. I mentioned this at the end of the last question, but my Shadow of the Sky absolutely needed a sequel. We sold it in a 1-book deal, so I was nervous that they would not let me write the sequel. And then I was so glad when my editor was like, "Yes, let's do the sequel. It needs a sequel." And I'm like, "Fantastic." Um, the quest of the first book is basically Marin trying to get her girlfriend back who's been abducted. And that's like a singular and individual thing that you wouldn't necessarily think has like greater implications on the rest of the world, because it's just, you know, one person. I'm trying to make a difference for one person. And at the end of the book, that quest does, you know, reach a conclusion. But what she discovers over the course of her book is that, you know, much like colonization, if you tug on one thread, it pulls a lot of other threads with it. And so she discovers at the end that, okay, well, I've reached the end of this quest with my girlfriend, but I've inadvertently tipped over a lot of other things that now are starting to fall down and have consequences on the rest of the world, which I really could not have done without writing a second book.
Yeah, I feel like for me, the first book required so much plot, so much setup of the world building that you could only do so much in it. So I was also really happy to have a sequel, especially because in the first book, the main character is really fighting to save her monster family from this human monster slayer. But in book 2, I really wanted her to explore the other side of it, to be starting to think, oh, what about the other side of my family, the other side of myself? I really wanted to ramp up the feeling that she's really starting to have to make some very impossible choices for herself. And I really wouldn't have been able to do that without a sequel. So I'm also very thankful that I was able to do that.
So for The Keeper of Night, without getting too spoilery, I definitely think a sequel was necessary for Ren's exploration of her identity. Because my book, the central conflict is very much, how do I find happiness as a biracial person who isn't accepted anywhere? And I really did not want to just, you know, tie it up with a bow and be like, here's how you do it. Everyone loves you and everything is happy now, because that's not how the real world works, and that's not how I feel or how I felt at the time. So book 1 was very much about validating that kind of pain, not with providing answers that may or may not exist. So then I started to write book 2, and I sort of started in this place where I'm like, okay, in this world now we know everything sucks, but now what? Like, what do we do with that information? Because you can't just roll over and give up. Like, that goes for me and my main character. So it was a question for both of us to figure out. So book 2 is very much about okay, so this is how the world is and how it's always going to be. How do I now build my own world inside of that? How do I surround myself with the right people so that this is bearable? And I'm really happy with leaving readers with that. So I really like the way this worked out as a duology, where I can validate these very intense emotions that I feel like are not always recognized by other people, but also not leave readers in a totally hopeless place.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question that I've just thought of now because I didn't realize for Rebecca and Tara that both of your books had been like one book first and then opened up to more books. So I wanted to know, was there anything then because of that, like really, really unexpected in writing the sequel, um, that happened because you might not have been planning on like this whole arc? Obviously, Vanessa and Kylie, you can answer if you have other unexpected things that happened in your sequels, but I'm particularly interested in changing like gears like that.
The plot of the second book totally changed. And it wasn't something that happened necessarily because all of a sudden I got to write a sequel, because I always wanted it to be 2 books. It's just that when we got the offer for the book, they only offered for 1. But I had this idea, geez, I don't even remember, was it Sherwood Smith? I think it was Sherwood Smith, the Crown Duel and Court Duel series. This is a long time ago. But there's this main character who I loved, who in is like a fighter and a rebel in the first book. I believe that's now been repackaged just into 1 volume. So if you get that one, you get the whole story. But it used to be the first book was like she's a fighter and a rebel. And then in the second book, she's thrust into the court dynamic, like after the rebellion. And she's sort of there kind of as a hostage and has to navigate the political landscape. Um, while trying to like do it better than she was a rebel, was she's really bad at it, so it doesn't go well for her. But I really loved that like fish out of water in a really dangerous scenario setup. So initially my plan for Shatter the Sky and then Storm the Earth was that Marin in the second book would have to um like kind of form this weird like handshake truce deal with the evil emperor and enter his palace kind of as a hostage, kind of as a guest in a similar scenario, because I wanted to explore that. And but then what happened was, as I was writing Shatter the Sky, I realized that would not work at all, because the more that I revised the book, the angrier she got about everything that was going on in the world. So basically, her fury over colonization made it impossible for her to be diplomatic with the emperor. And I had to completely scrap my plans for the sequel and come up with an entire new plot from scratch.
My journey with Timekeeper was a very unusual one, and I don't recommend it to anybody. Timekeeper was my debut, and before that, I had written many other books that I didn't really try to get published. I just, have a hyperfixation with writing. So I actually had written all 3 books before I got my deal for the trilogy, which is almost unheard of. And I don't recommend it because I had a lot to revise with book 2 specifically. But I still think the majority of the revisions went into book 1 because of everything that I discovered in writing books 2 and 3. And I think one of the biggest things for me was actually Daphne, because when I wrote the first book, I think I give her like one scene where she actually has a POV, and I did not realize at the time that she was actually going to become the 3rd protagonist of the series, and so that it would be switching between Danny Colton and Daphne. And so that was, especially when I realized that like they were going to India and there's like all this digging that I had to do with Daphne, and my editor helped me as well with that. And so kind of like what happened in book 2 actually informed how I revised book 1, especially in terms of Daphne, because my first draft of Timekeeper, she was just like, she was one of those archetypes where she's like a bitch. Just because, but she's not actually, like, once Danny gets to like know her a little bit more, he's like, oh, that's where you're coming from. You're not a bitch. I'm sorry. But then in writing the sequels, I was like, oh no, okay, I gotta go in and tweak a little bit more. So it was kind of the reverse of the sequels actually informed more of book 1 than I thought they would.
Vanessa and Kylie, do you have anything that you want to share unexpected for your sequels?
No, mine was, I was lucky that I sold 3 all at once, and so I kind of knew the arcs that were going to happen. Yeah, I feel like I wasn't sure as I was writing book 1 that I was going to be able to write anymore until I sold it. So I did feel very lucky and happy to be able to do that. Was there anything surprising that happened? I think in the plot, yes, but in the character arcs, no. I kind of always knew how those arcs would go. And then I'm kind of jealous, Tara. I wish I had been able to write all 3 all at once, because I love being able to go back and tinker a little bit. So as I was writing book 2, I was lucky to have book 1 still at kind of copy edit, so I could add some foreshadowing, add some setup of plot. So yeah, I feel like I don't know if anything unexpected happened, but I suppose I added extra world building that I didn't think I was going to be able to do.
Absolutely everything was unexpected about my sequel. I had no idea what I was doing at all. I mean, it all worked out in the end. I will say, at first I thought it got more hopeful. I had an original ending that was significantly less hopeful than what it ended up being, which I think is for the better.
By the way, if you all have any questions as well, please drop them in the chat. I always forget to like remind people, so this is my reminder to everyone else. On topic of biracial main characters, I wanted to talk a little bit about family, because understandably it is a large theme. And so it's it's a large theme in sort of fiction as a whole, and also specifically in your books. So I wanted to ask what it was like to create family dynamics within your books, and sort of to able to see them evolve in relation to the main character, right? Because I feel like when I think of a main character as a non-writer, I think of the main character as, like this focal point in the universe, basically, and then all these other characters evolving sort of in parallel lines. But so I wanted to know about like the family around them and how they react slash maybe impact like your main character's arc. So Tara, do you want to start?
I feel like this one, like I feel like I have a very boring answer for this one, because with Timekeeper, with Daphne's family is basically like not really in the picture. So a lot of how she evolves and a lot of that stuff is more of like the found family dynamics that she gets. Especially like when they go to India and I introduce some more secondary characters who are fully Indian, and the way that she kind of plays off of them is very like reaffirming for her and very validating for her. And then in Scavenge, Amaya's mother is dead and her father is dead. So, or is he? But so a lot of the times the way that she interacts with her family is through like their ghosts, not literally, but like the ghosts of like their memories, and like she feels very haunted by them basically. And like how she grew up and like what her parents taught her, and like those lessons kind of coming out in the present day and helping her even years and years later. And I don't want to spoil anything, but there could be something maybe in the sequel that like also happens to in terms of that. Um, but I'd say with both of these characters, they actually find more of themselves in a found family than their actual families, which I think is very true for a lot of especially queer folks nowadays, kind of finding that validation through other means.
Are we still going in order?
I was just about to call on you guys.
Okay, perfect. I read your mind. So in my story, in The Keeper of Night, my biracial main character has a half brother named Nevin who's completely white, which was an interesting experience for me to write about and also to see how it was received, because it let me speak to different levels of privilege and empathy, even within families who love each other. So Nevin is a very nice person, while Ren is not, to put it lightly, but that's a direct result of all the bullying she experienced because of her race. And at one point in the story, when they're in Japan, Nevin is sad and frustrated that he doesn't fit in there, and Ren is kind of like, "Welcome to my world. Like, do you want a gold star? It's been 3 days." Like, she's very unsympathetic to him, and it's been very interesting to me how many people comment on that scene and interpret it as Ren just being really mean for no reason. And I feel like it has a lot to do with how people of color are expected to express their anger politely about racism. And I think Nevin he reads as a very sympathetic character, even when hardly anything bad has happened to him and he's complaining about it, because he's this very sweet, polite, blonde, white boy, whereas Ren, who has suffered 1,000 times more than him, is expected to coddle him or be seen as a bad person. She's expected to just sort of get over it or be nice about it, at least, while he's not. And I think that can be reflective of this issue in mixed families, where you have varying levels of privilege and you end up with some people saying things like, "I can't be racist. I love my niece who is Black," even though that says nothing about whether or not you personally have done the work to be anti-racist.
In Shadow of the Sky, Marin has parents. Her mom and dad are not dead, and I didn't want them to be dead. That was another trope. I was like, I'm gonna, not do this time. And she also has an older brother who is not in the first book at all, and then makes an appearance in the second book. And for me, it was important to remove Marin from all of her family because she's such a little mouse homebody that she needed to be really pushed out the door in order to find her own strength and grow as a person, basically. And then when she meets up with her brother again, he's surprised by how different she is. So I really was thinking about, the dynamic of sometimes, like, you can't grow. Sometimes your own family can't really see you clearly until or unless they haven't seen you in a while. Um, I actually really like Marin's older brother, whose name I do not remember, um, because he was another, he also is biracial, half Varen and half Safedi, and he leaves the mountain to go into Zafed and then decides, you know what, I'm also going to leave Zafed entirely. So he's spent a lot of time in this island nation that is even further distant, that Marin doesn't see at all. And then when he appears, he brings with him a totally different perspective than she has on, what the dynamic is between Zafed and Ilvera, and oh look, there are other ways of living that you just like, it doesn't even occur to you because you've never seen it before.
I made Joan's families very loving. I think because I didn't want the conflict to come from her families. When I was growing up, I was in that first generation of Asian Australians to be born after the end of what they call the White Australia policy, which meant that at the time it was very hard for anyone who wasn't European to immigrate to Australia. And it meant when I was growing up, there just weren't many people at all around me who looked like me. Well, that's really changed now. But my own experience growing up was really that the home was very safe and loving on both sides, and then sometimes the world was a little bit unsafe and a bit scary. And I wanted that same kind of experience for Joan, where the conflicts are coming from the outside, but also not so much my experience, but the conflicts are coming where both sides are clashing. They're both having mutually exclusive goals that are both understandable, and yet the position that Joan is in is very complicated. It's like it's very hard for her to take a side, because if she does take a side, if she does choose one side, it's not possible to do that, I guess, without hurting herself. So that was what I was really interested in as I was writing. Yeah, not so much that any conflict was coming from her family. Both sides, she would die for them, they would die for her. But what does that mean when they would also kill each other?
So Kylie, you mentioned it a little bit. My next question was about reception, about books and publication. So my question was sort of about the reception. I was envisioning it to be, I personally have felt very validated within all of your books. I think that while I am not biracial, I'm a transracial adoptee, and so I feel like the what I love about your characters are the ways in which like you all navigate belonging, and how it changes throughout your life, whatever the time span of the book in terms of like days is, right? But also how you feel kind of sometimes stuck between like two different places, right? So I felt that's what part of the reason why I wanted to do this panel, but I also wanted to ask about like reception as well. And yeah, do you want to start, Kylie?
Sure. So I've spoken to and heard from a lot of really lovely readers who have said that my books meant a lot to them. I've also gotten less wonderful feedback from a lot of people who, surprisingly, with my debut novel, I didn't expect this. They weren't criticizing my writing or any like structural issues with the book. It was criticizing the way that I, as a biracial woman, chose to write about a biracial character, or questioning certain elements of the experience. Like, do biracial kids actually get bullied? Like, people who aren't biracial raising these very dismissive questions and saying certain things aren't realistic, even when they have no experience with it, and I do. So what I ended up doing after that is pulling back a lot with each book. So in the Keeper of Night duology, the central conflict is very, very explicitly about being biracial and biracial identity. In my next duology, The Scarlet Alchemist, the main character is biracial, but that's not her central conflict. It's just an aspect of her identity that does impact her life because she lives in the real world, but it's not her biggest problem. And then I drew back even more with my horror debut, where it's hardly mentioned at all. And I think that's a result of some of the feedback that I wasn't very thrilled to receive. And I'm not saying there's a correct way to write about biracial identity. Like, if you want to get really deep into it or pull back, I think there's lots of different ways to do it. But just personally, I wouldn't write a book about biracial identity as personal as The Keeper of Night again, because it was really hard to put out this book that is like, here's my identity, please understand how much this hurts me, and to have a lot of people say, I don't believe you. That's not true. It doesn't happen like that. Like, that's really hard.
Yeah. I kind of had a little bit of a similar situation, not like, fortunately, if there were any readers who kind of like brought that up, I must have like dodged them. But there was a very prolific trade reviewer that dug into my Timekeeper trilogy in terms of Indian representation and Daphne's arc specifically, to which I will forever hold a vendetta because, yeah, that was a time, and it was very like it was very, very hurtful because I think Daphne is in the Timekeeper trilogy, her whole arc is like like what you said with your debut, it's like the closest that I'm ever going to get with these like feelings that I have. I think it's like the most personal that I'm ever going to get. I think I am going to write another book like discussing more like biracial stuff, but I imagine it as like an adult book and like a secondary fantasy world. So that's going to have some different, other sort of complications. But Even though this trade reviewer was just like incredibly like, and it was funny because when we brought up this issue, because it was so unbearably harsh, that me and my editor actually went to them being like, hey, what's the basis for all of this? It's very strange and very nitpicky and it feels very targeted. And they said, well, we got an Indian reviewer to do it. And I was like, that's why, because a lot of the times the call comes from within the house. So that was very off-putting. But I have had a lot of very, very lovely readers who are full Indian but experience diaspora write to me or come up to me saying, I saw myself in Daphne, even though she is white passing and I'm not. Like, a lot of her experiences are experiences that I have also had when going to India. So that was very validating, and also like a big fu to the to the trade reviewer.
I remember that, the whole timekeeper thing, and that was awful, and it made me mad as a biracial person. I haven't had like anyone come up to me and say like, I hate the biracial representation in your book, your secondary world fantasy book. And I'm like, because then that would be very odd feedback to get. Like what are you comparing it to? Like, it's fiction, like it's totally made up. Are you saying that like Ilvera is comparable to this race, or like, how can it be accurate, or more accurate or less accurate? So I've been lucky to have dodged that, and I think part of the reason is because I wrote a secondary world fantasy novel. But I was really thinking about, you know a lot of biracial people, certainly not all of them, but many of them, especially in the United States, are half something and half white, as I am. I'm half Korean and half white. And what does it mean to be, part of a dominant culture in that way? And that's something that Marin struggles with in the series, as she is like, she feels in her heart very Varen, but then when she goes to Zafed, she has to really grapple with, what does it really mean for my identity that I'm also Zafedi? I haven't really thought about that because I haven't had to think about that. And there was a really lovely review of the book on Tor.com that really got at what I was trying to do with it. And so that was extremely validating to be like, oh, you recognized it, you know what I was doing. I'm actually very nervous to write about like being biracial in the real world, and I am working on something right now that has that in it, and I am nervous about it. I'm trying not to let that stop me from doing what I'm doing, but I'm like a little not sure. We'll see.
I think I've had a similar experience to Rebecca, mostly good experience, where people would, come up to me and say that they'd never seen themselves in a book before. Probably, especially in Australia. I think someone just did a count of how many genre books were coming out by Asian authors in Australia this year, and it was like 4, so including mine. So I think I'm lucky or not lucky. I'm really one of the few people writing like this in Australia. So I've mostly had good experiences. Makes me really sad to hear that some of you had bad feedback, because I haven't read your book, Tara, yet, but Kylie's really resonated with me. Like, I felt so seen and represented when I was reading that book. So definitely the audience that it's meant for really feels it, Kylie. I was thinking about this question, and in a way, one of the strange things is I don't think I've had pushback so much, but I think sometimes it's easier to talk about the book as if the main character is just Asian rather than half Asian, half white, because when you're pitching a book, when people are talking about a book, it's hard to say what it's about in a complex way. You tend to simplify, so that people are just really clear in their mind what it's about. So, and yet her being biracial is really important to her identity in the book, and it's really important to me. And I've got this line in book 2 about how even Joan herself sometimes calls herself half, as if she's like construction blocks that can be pulled apart and then put back together again. But it's really not like that. Being biracial and having biracial characters are really their own thing, their own separate thing. So I'm really interested in those specific stories as well.
One of the questions that we've gotten specifically talked about representation and seeing yourself in specifically TV shows. And so they wanted to know if there had been any recent TV characters that you've been able to see yourselves in, or are you still waiting?
Still waiting.
Still waiting. Yeah.
Yeah. But I will say something, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it made me feel happy when I saw it was so most of us are probably passingly familiar, right, with like Harry and Meghan and all that stuff that's been going on. And Meghan is famously biracial, black and white. And she used to be an actress, as most everyone knows, and her biggest role was on the TV show Suits, which I like binged quite recently. And because it's sort of impossible to avoid Megan stuff on the internet right now, which is kind of unfortunate, something popped up that I read and I was like, oh, this makes me feel like good and happy, which is that she was talking about, being a biracial actress and struggling with, getting called in for parts for like the exotic looking friend or whatever, and nothing that was written specifically for her identity. And then she said, on Suits, that was my first experience where my character was explicitly written as biracial. And they asked me, about my experience, and on the show, her father, the actor who plays her father, is black, and the actress who plays her mother is white. And that's something that they explicitly wrote into the show for her character. And that was just really lovely and validating to see, even though it didn't speak to my exact experience. It was like, yeah, like this is a specific experience that they wrote to intentionally. And it wasn't just like, oh, the exotic looking one who's tan. So that was nice.
Yeah. Still waiting. I think I'm going to have to wait for a long time. Because I feel like it's especially like if you are white passing biracial, it's very difficult to like put that across in like a visual way instead of like just hiring a white actor. You know what I mean? So still waiting.
Okay, I'm trying to pick like the perfect last question. So that's why I'm looking like I'm not paying attention because I'm trying to figure out what is like the good question to end on. Okay. Why don't we do Oh, this is an interesting one for me. I want to know, what is a hobby or skill you've always wanted to learn or you're just starting to learn? I've really been in like embracing like late stage adult crafting. So that's why I want to know. I mean, like I don't feel like I'm necessarily like a late stage adult, but you know what I mean, like crafting as an adult basically. So I want to know for you all, like if there's something kind of similar that you're trying to do or that you've always wanted to do. Kylie, do you want to start?
I was into crocheting for a while, but I've sort of been discouraged because my day job also involves a lot of like very detailed work with my hands, and I'm very wary of just destroying my hands from the combination of typing and like doing all this detailed work. I always dreamed about being able to play the piano. I can't honestly say I have plans to do that in the immediate future because I already have an instrument that I studied for 20 years that is now gathering dust in the corner of my room. And that is a cello, so that should probably be what I go back to first. But life is long, so maybe someday I can do it all.
We like should talk about that because, as you know, there's a piano in my house that I also haven't really played for like 20 years. And I did also try to play the cello.
We'll just do it together.
Yeah. But in terms of things that I'm actually doing right now, I picked up the pandemic sourdough habit quite late, like only this year. But now I have my starter and it's doing well, and I bake bread every week. In fact, there I have a timer that's like, okay, 30 minutes from now, it's time to put my bread in the oven. That's what I'll be doing when we're
It's
done
really
here.
good bread. It tastes really
Yeah.
good.
And I've been really happy with that. And funny also that you should mention crocheting because I literally just started with one of the Woobles kits, which I'm sure you've seen advertised to you on Instagram. Um, and it was very easy. And my fatal flaw is that I'm one of those people that's like naturally very good at a number of things. So if I ever try something that I'm not naturally good at immediately, I'm like, forget this. Like, this is terrible. I'm not going to try. I'm not going to do it. Um, so thankfully, crocheting was a thing that was also like, okay, I'm not perfect at it, but I'm good at it naturally. This looks good. And now I'm like, I'm going to become a master crocheter and crochet all the things, and it's going to be great. So those are 2 adult hobbies that I'm doing.
I feel like last time I was asked this question, I said that I had taken up gardening, which I'd never had any interest in before. But during lockdown, I started gardening. But I've since killed all those plants twice over. So I killed them. I bought more. I killed them again. I'm going to try again because I feel like practice makes perfect. Yeah, they died in my last series of coffee edits and proofreads. I think the only thing my sourdough during the pandemic as well was that I saw this documentary on speed Rubik's cubing. So I watched YouTube to figure out how to solve a Rubik's cube, but I wouldn't say that I could do it very fast. It's very slow solving. But yes, I think those were my two very sad lockdown.
But you can do it, which is something
Yeah,
I've
it's just
never done
a
before.
series of several algorithms. Everyone can do it if you watch YouTube.
I also had a crochet period, but it was in college. So I did a lot of crochet. So I wish I had something here, but they're like all in my bedroom. But I did like little traffic cones. I did a banana, a cute little banana with a little face. It was great. But then I do have like a hand nerve condition. So I'm like, I can only use my hands for writing in video games. And like that's it. That's all I can do. So I can't crochet anymore. I can't knit. I've always really wanted to like really get into drawing. Like I drew a lot when I was younger. And I was like passable at it, but I've always wanted to get like really really good at it, but like with the hand stuff and my lack of patience with not being good, I'm and also supplies are just very expensive. I'm like, maybe one of these days if I have like a lot more downtime and my hands miraculously get a little bit better. um I also used to sing a lot. I did lots of choral stuff. I was in musicals. So I think one of these days I would like to pick up voice lessons again. So that would be nice. But yeah, for now, my life is mostly just writing books and playing video games and watching anime.
Yeah, I mean, I specifically asked this question because I because I started to crochet. That's why I was asking this. But then it goes full circle basically from like Kylie to Rebecca to Tara because then I hurt my wrist crocheting and and so then I couldn't like do anything. I couldn't type and stuff and use my wrist to like pick up objects for like 3 weeks.
Yeah,
Um
I'm on the crochet Reddit right now, and people go in and they ask all these questions, and then people who know what they're talking about answer them. And somebody's like, "I help me, I'm addicted, I can't stop." And they're like, "No, you should only be doing like 1 hour a day. Like, don't hurt your wrists." Yeah. It's perfect for me because I watch so much TV. That's my like relax my brain activity. But I always find myself like scrolling on my phone and half watching TV. And I feel like it would be a much healthier and more productive thing to crochet and half watch TV. So that's what I'm gonna do now.
yeah, I landed on Crochet Talk. Um and because of that then now I own like compression gloves, and I own like a specific wrist ice pack for my crocheting wrist. So yeah, like speaking of toxic traits, I think that mine has been that, like, which I don't think is specific to me, but it's, that thing where like you pick up a hobby and you're like determined that it's going to be your thing, and then you invest a lot of time and money into that hobby for you to like never do it or to drop it like 6 months later. I think that's like very relatable for a lot of people.
That was fountain pens for me. I'm still using them, but I have a lot of them and I have so much ink, and it's a lot. It's a lot more than I need, but I love them.
I feel like these are all like very stereotypical bookish person hobbies. Like everyone crochets, everyone likes stationery and like pretty pens and stuff like that.
I feel like the stereotypical author hobby these days is like computer and video games, and I feel like I'm the only one who's not in there.
That's so weird because it used to be not that at all. Like I used to be in the minority when I say that I was like a gamer and that I played video games, but I feel like within the past 5 years, people have just been like consuming them. I think like the Switch and like
Yeah,
a lot of like indie
I
games
think
coming
that
out are becoming
really,
more accessible to a lot of people who don't consider themselves gamers.
yeah.
I bought a Switch 2 months ago. I've caved. I'm even more stereotypical now.
Nice.
I mean, I feel like it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. I've been really
It's
holding
looming
out.
in the background.
Well, that's same with Dungeons and Dragons. That's the other thing. It's like
I love
literally
Dungeons and Dragons.
everyone I know is in a D&D campaign, and it's just me. I'm the last one. Yeah.
It's great. It's a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for chatting and for making this panel dream come true. Also, thank you for the question and the chat in the chats. I've left everyone's bookshop.org, I think, links in the description box below. So definitely please check them out and pre-order and also pick up all of these fantastic books. And I hope that everyone has a really great rest of your day. And yeah, that we can all enjoy, as the commenter says, more biracial fantasy characters. Oh, but they said with hand nerve disabilities who like to crochet. That's like super specific.
I'm on the case.
Yeah, that'll be everyone's like next thing, right? Try to put some sort of fiber art into your characters and your character worlds. So we'll like reconvene in a couple of years when that happens for everybody. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank